grace,
God's grace,
God's grace,
God's grace,
grace, grace, God's grace, grace, grace. God's grace is sufficient for me, oh. Grace, 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 God's grace, grace, grace. God's grace is sufficient for me, oh. I get my heart focusing on where my treasure is. I get my heart focusing on where my treasure is. I get my heart focusing on where my treasure is. God's grace is sufficient for me. God's grace is sufficient for me.
God's grace, God's grace,
Sufficient, sufficient, sufficient. God's grace is sufficient for me. God's grace is sufficient for me. Even though
you've been overlooked and you've been victimized,
but here is the good news, good news, good news. God's grace is sufficient for you. God's grace is sufficient for you. Just get your heart focusing on where your treasure is. God's grace is sufficient for you. Get your heart focusing on where your treasure is. The grace of God will take us to our destiny, 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 destiny. Focus. Never ever give up. By the grace of God, we can defeat. We can defeat the devil. Grace, 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 God's grace, grace, grace. God's grace is sufficient for me, oh.